to you to be here with us. So it's a high expectation from the group. And I think, maybe we have a good number, yeah?
Yeah, almost everyone, yeah.
We should start with, the recording is fine.
The recording is fine. No. Yeah, we need to.
Yeah.
It is something. Yeah, but we need to record right now.
Okay.
You're not
Good.
recording for us. Okay. So everyone just keep it there. So we are transmitting this class by YouTube because we want everyone to have access to what you have to say about climate anxiety, and it's a really good thing to have you with us here today. So the idea, as I mentioned to you by email, is that we have like 1 hour of your talk, and then we will open for questions, if that's okay for you, because otherwise just 2 questions at the same time as you speak. What do you prefer? For us to have the questions later, after your talk, or just to speak with you as you talk?
I think questions at the end is good.
Okay. So now the students will conduct the meeting, because one of the things that we propose here is that students learn how to act and how to work as professors. This is very important for our seminars. And you will be here asking questions at the end of your talk. Thank you.
Okay, so let's start it. Good morning, Susan. Good morning, everyone. I'm Fernando. I'm going to be the host today. I'm going to start by introducing Professor Clayton. So Professor Susan Clayton is a professor of psychology and environmental studies at the College of Worcester in Ohio, USA. Professor Clayton earned her bachelor's degree from Carleton College and her master's and PhD degrees from Mayo University. Her research focuses on the psychological aspects of human-environment relationships. She developed the environmental identity scale to assess the role of nature in personal identity. Her work also examines psychological responses to climate change, including climate anxiety, for which she co-created a measurement tool. She contributed to the 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, reviewing research on climate change and mental health. As part of the conservation psychology community, she seeks to advance the role of psychology in promoting environmental sustainability. Therefore, Professor Clayton's work aligns with the Sustainable Development Goals number 13, Climate Action, and number 17, Partnerships for the Goals. You have the word now, Professor Susan.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you all this morning. As I mentioned earlier, I'm recovering from a cold, so I apologize if my voice is a little bit harsh. What I want to do today is really talk about the role of psychology in understanding the ways in which people respond to climate change, including both impacts on their mental health and also behavioral responses. So I'd like to start by just a little visual reminder of what we're hearing about or what we're thinking about when we think about climate change. Some recent headlines from major newspapers. So record numbers of natural disasters, extremely high temperatures, and the expanding range of diseases. So climate change is definitely having an impact. I'm sure I don't have to assure you of that. And a few years ago, or about a year ago, the head of the UN described it as humanity has opened the gates to hell. So it's really a big crisis. I think the question, though, is why should psychologists be involved in addressing climate change? And I see three areas in which psychologists and psychological research can really contribute. One is to, and I'll describe these one at a time. One is to investigate the ways in which people understand the idea of climate change. One is to explore the consequences for human behavior and psychological well-being of climate change. And one is to encourage a positive response to climate change, because increasingly this is what we're going to have to confront and to have to respond to, is the idea that climate change is happening. No matter what we do at this point, there is already some degree of change. It will continue. So what are the positive ways to respond to that? So first, I want to address this question of how do people understand the topic of climate change? And I think we all recognize that one of the big challenges for climate change has been that people do not understand, or at least scientists are puzzled in many ways that, given the evidence of the threat that is posed by climate change, there's not a more substantial public response. There's not more environmental policy designed at addressing the problem. So the assumption is, in a way, that people don't understand just how serious the problem is. If they did, they would do more about it. One of the barriers, or one of the sort of categories of barriers, is just our limits on the ways we think about things. So for many people, they just don't know enough. There may be an information gap. They don't understand how climate works. I mean, many people don't understand how climate works, et cetera, where they just don't get the information about the changes. There's also, we sometimes have not a very good ability to think about problems that seem very remote. So as long as people are not personally affected by climate change, it seems very far away. So there's a psychological distance. And another category that sort of restricts our ability to think about climate change is a tendency to ignore the environment, the physical environment in general. And Robert Gifford talked about this as environmental numbness. As a species, we are essentially predisposed to focus on other humans and to pay less attention to our physical environmental surroundings. And especially when changes are small and gradual, we are just not really alert to those changes that might be happening. Perhaps more significant barriers to understanding are associated with our desire to protect our own emotions. So because we don't want to feel bad, to feel scared all the time, many people are in denial about the extent of the problem. They refuse to believe that it's happening. They might just not invest, and I think this is true of a lot of people, not invest much emotional response in it at all. So there, again, despite the degree of the problem, there can be some apathy. And I also include in this category the idea of system justification, that we want to believe that the system, the social system, the societal system we live in is a good system and a well-functioning system. And climate change essentially challenges that and says, no, something is wrong with this system. We need to change. And that's a very hard acknowledgement for people to make. So they are motivated to continue to believe that the current system is a good one. And then we have these ideological frameworks that are encouraging people to not pay attention to climate change. And those can range in a variety of ways. One can be, for some people, religious beliefs. Certainly in the area that I live, a lot of conservative Christians believe that humans cannot affect the environment because that's God's. So it's essentially incredible for them to believe that humans could have an effect on the environment. For other people, there's kind of an ideological tendency to believe that technology will save us. So things might be problematic right now, but someone will come up with a technological fix and then it will be fine. And beliefs in economic systems such as capitalism can also convince people that everything will work out and we don't need to do anything about it. I want to highlight the sort of social norms that surround our inability to completely come to grips with climate change. And there's a phenomenon that some of you may be familiar with of collective ignorance, where people faced with a potentially problematic situation tend to look around at other people and see how other people are responding. And if other people don't seem to be responding, then the individual will conclude it's not really a problem. The trouble is everybody is looking to each other, and so no one is responding, and there's an underestimate of the fact that it's a serious problem. And here are some data that were discovered in a survey a few years back, that people tended to think that they themselves were more personally concerned than other people were. So I think that there is that widespread lack of recognition that other people care about climate change. And especially in the United States, but not only there, there are group identities associated with our understandings of climate change. So stereotypes about the kind of people who care about the environment. Some research has suggested that, perhaps, for example, women should care more than men. It's a feminine sort of thing to care about the environment. Also that, or maybe certain demographic groups are the ones who care about the environment. Group polarization, often associated with political party. So the belief that a certain political group cares more about climate change, therefore, if you're a member of the other group, you're not allowed to care. So essentially what happens is that your attitudes about climate change are not based on actually thinking about the issue, but just thinking about, well, how does my group feel about this issue? So those are all things that just make it difficult and challenging for us to think about climate change in a rational way. And I think we need to bear in mind those cognitive limitations as we think through the broader questions of how people are reacting to climate change. What I've been doing for a few years is focusing more on this idea of the human consequences of climate change. And one useful way to think about this, I think, is some of you may be familiar with Bronfenbrenner's systems theory, thinking about the various levels of that affect all of us, and the circle. And you may not be able to read all of the type there, which is fine, but just thinking about the outside circle is the actual changing climate, the geophysical changes like quality of air, temperatures, rising sea levels, and so on. But that affects within that the macro system, which is cultural changes in response to the geophysical changes. And then the exosystem, the societal systems are also affected. That can include migration, international conflict, etc. The community experiences like threats to infrastructure or financial hardship because of threats to employment and so on. The microsystem, which is our interpersonal interactions and how those are affected by climate change. And all of these different levels combine to mediate the impacts of the changing climate on the inner circle, our mental health and well-being. When I think about the effects of climate change, I tend to divide them into 4 categories. One is the acute events, the things that have a beginning and an end, tend to capture a lot of attention, a lot of media coverage, things like major storms, wildfires, and floods. Then the chronic changes, these are the less dramatic, slower changes in the climate, but that will ultimately affect everyone because they tend to, they keep progressing. Whereas in the acute events, you return to baseline, the chronic changes just accumulate. Then there are the indirect impacts. Some of these were sort of highlighted in the nested circles that I just showed you. So climate change increases displacement, threatens physical health, threatens economic well-being. And then, very interesting to me, the impacts of our thoughts and perceptions about climate change, a sort of existential anxiety that might occur in response. So in terms of the acute impacts, we have decades of research on the impacts of extreme weather events. Extreme weather events have always happened. They're not just due to climate change. Of course, climate change makes them worse, and either more intense and or more frequent. But we know that they are associated with increased rates of mental health problems, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, suicide, substance abuse, sleep disorders, and violence. For example, just a fairly recent 2017 hurricane in Puerto Rico, so long enough ago that we've had the time to collect the data and publish the data. About a fifth of people affected needed mental health services. There were increased rates in suicide, in post-traumatic stress disorder, and in the use of medication for emotional problems. Wildfire has been something that certainly in some countries around the world, including the United States, we've been very focused on recently. And the largest fire at that point in California, that Camp Fire, led to, again, significantly increased rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and depression. And also, the only study yet that I have seen that looked at this actually did some EEGs to look at brain functioning and found different patterns of brain activation among people who've been directly exposed to the wildfire, suggesting, probably a temporary, but an impact on the ways in which they organize their cognitive resources to accomplish cognitive tasks. And a fairly recent meta-analysis looked at 7 million people who'd been exposed to wildfires in California and found a statistically significant increase in psychoactive medication compared to the baseline. So we are seeing these kinds of impacts. And of course, the impacts can last. So 1 week, 2 weeks after the event, people may be trying to get back to normal, rebuild their community. But the mental health impacts can linger. In this particular study, they went back to the community in Canada a year after a wildfire and still found significantly elevated levels of mental health problems. So there's really no question that there's just a vast amount of data about the ways in which people's mental health is affected by these kinds of extreme weather events. The chronic changes were not as, they're still not as recognized. And I think there was very little research on this until fairly recently. But it's a rapidly growing body of research looking at the impacts, for example, of higher temperatures and new abilities to gather a lot of data, have used very large data sets and found that higher temperatures, sort of above average temperatures, are significantly associated with increases in suicide, psychiatric hospitalization, aggression, and just decreases in positive mood overall. There are many possible reasons for this. They may all be true. Certainly there are direct impacts of heat on the brain, a sort of neuroinflammation effect. Also, we know that heat leads to more negative social behavior, more aggressive social behavior. So there's more, other people are a source of stress due to these higher temperatures. And a pretty significant impact just of loss of sleep. because loss of sleep, it's harder for people to sleep when it's very hot. And when you can't sleep very well, ultimately you do not have the cognitive resources to cope well with the kinds of things that you might have to deal with in everyday life. And it's, again, a significant impairment in your ability that might ultimately be associated with mental health problems. Air pollution, too, which is associated with climate change, also has mental health problems. So climate change, of course, is most strongly linked to the burning of fossil fuels, which we know leads to air pollution, is associated with decreased air quality. Also, warmer temperatures tend to hold more pollutants. So we are faced with lower quality air when the temperatures are higher. And this has been linked to reduced cognitive abilities, neurodegenerative diseases, depression, suicide, and behavioral problems among children. So even though these are, people don't necessarily recognize the link between these physical impacts and the mental consequences, but they definitely seem to be there. Now, the indirect impacts of climate change are harder to study, of course, but they're very profound. As I suggested earlier, 3 of the biggest problems are involuntary displacement, where people are forced to migrate to leave their home because of the changing climatic conditions. It could be if you live in a coastal community, it essentially is threatened by rising sea levels. It could be desertification, so that the place you live no longer provides enough fresh water. If you're dependent on glaciers for your water supply, as is true for many people in Peru, for example, there may no longer be an adequate source of fresh water. If you live in a place where the community is built on permafrost, and the permafrost is thawing, the community is also threatened. So many people becoming environmental refugees. Also, of course, the impacts of climate change have economic effects, and people lose their jobs, their housing is damaged or destroyed, and they need to replace that. So definitely financial costs. And food insecurity is actually one of the things that the United Nations think is the biggest threat from climate change. We know that on average, agriculture is threatened by the rising temperatures, although there are some places that will do better. On average, it will be worse. And research shows that some food actually has lower nutritional value when it's grown in higher temperatures. And all of these things threaten mental health. So migration is, of course, very stressful. As one thinks about leaving, it's stressful to experience those conditions. The actual process of leaving is stressful, and being in the new place is stressful. Often people are not well accepted by the community, by the existing community when they move to a new place, as I think we all know. So for all of these reasons, immigrants are at increased risk of mental health problems. And this is true not just among the original immigrants, but among their offspring, because there's still that lack of acceptance and perhaps social conflict. Economic insecurity also threatens mental health. We know that being poor, people who are impoverished are more likely to experience depression and anxiety. And there's actually good evidence that it's a causal impact, because when a society introduces policies and programs to mitigate the impacts of poverty or provide financial support for people who have lost their jobs, mental health tends to improve. And particularly important, people who experience poverty as children may have an increased lifetime risk of mental illness or impaired cognitive development. So these effects can be really persistent. Very similar impacts of food insecurity, that it's associated with worse mental health, that children who experience food insecurity have lifetime increased rates of depression. And although food insecurity is associated with income, household income, it's not the same thing. And if you control for household income, you still find a separate impact of food insecurity. So all of these indirect impacts of climate change are likely to increase threats to mental health. Now, when I think about mental health, for me, it's very important to not define that simply as increased experiences of things like anxiety, depression, but also the ability to function effectively and to live up to your potential. So this includes cognitive abilities. And we know that both the acute impacts, like the extreme weather events, and the chronic conditions such as heat have demonstrated impacts on cognitive functioning. Again, that may have a particular impact on children. So people who have been through wildfire do less well on verbal and math tests. There may be these long-term impacts on working memory. And we know this has been a significant topic in the last year or so as we've been breaking temperature records. High temperatures impair learning and performance. School children do not do as well when they are being tested under very high temperatures. Workers on the job are more likely to make mistakes. This is particularly true when they're engaged in complex tasks. So those effects are worth bearing in mind. And social relationships, I think, are also an important part of mental health. Climate change can interfere with normal social behavior. If it's very hot, people are less likely to simply linger in public spaces and talk to their neighbors. They might be more likely to want to retreat to a home in which they have shade, air conditioning, fans, whatever. We also, as I mentioned earlier, know that heat increases sort of aggression and hostile interpersonal behavior. Also, there are cases in which changes in the environment literally make social interactions more difficult. For example, people who live in the far north, where in the winter, the assumption is there'll be lots of snow, there'll be lots of ice, and they're used to using snowmobiles to get around. When the temperatures are rising, it doesn't become warm. There's still snow and ice, but it's inconsistent. So a lake that might in the past have frozen solid might freeze and then thaw and freeze and then thaw. So it's dangerous for them to go out on the ice to cross the lake to visit neighbors. Or the land may have snow and then the snow melts and it thaws and it becomes very difficult to get around either in a wheeled vehicle or in a snowmobile. So it's just harder to get around. At a more cognitive level, there's some interesting research that shows if you remind people about climate change, they're more likely to express hostility and suspicion towards people who are not members of their own group. So again, thinking very broadly about mental health, there are a variety of ways in which mental health is impaired by climate change. What I've been working on more recently is this idea of, vicarious experience of climate change. So you don't necessarily, many of us have not directly experienced, other than maybe some high temperatures, we haven't directly experienced the effects of climate change, but we're very aware of it as a problem. And this awareness brings worry. And we know this from international surveys and national surveys. People have a very high level of concern about climate change. And for some people, this level of concern sort of progresses into a very intense experience of anxiety. And so here are some quotes that I sort of have heard over the past few years from climate activists. One talking about feeling panicky, a sort of physical arousal. One talked about impaired eating behavior. One talking about this sort of behavioral paralysis where they just kind of froze and could not proceed. So this, to me as a psychologist, certainly signals a problematic impact of concern about climate on mental health and well-being. And I started to see people in, the mainstream media talking about climate anxiety. Now, anxiety of any sort can be adaptive. It's not wrong to be anxious about a real problem, and that can actually be useful to remind us to focus on that problem and try to solve it. But it does become a mental health problem when it starts to impair your ability to function. So with my colleague, Brian Carazia, we decided to develop a measure of climate change anxiety to see if it really had these sort of clinical implications. Did it impair functioning? And we found two factors in our measure. One associated with impairment to cognitions and emotions. For example, thinking about climate change makes it difficult for me to concentrate. One focused on impacts on behavior, such as my concerns about climate change interfere with my ability to have fun or my ability to work, that kind of thing. So who is actually worried about climate change? The short answer is everyone. And these are data from a study that was published back in 2021. We looked at 10,000 people in 10 different countries around the world, including Brazil. And you find, this is a complex figure, but essentially the only people who are not worried are the small purple bars at the end. Even the people who are a little bit worried are in the green. So you can see, between 70 and 80% of people in each country are at least moderately worried. And then the sort of gray or light blue bars are the proportion of people who said their concerns about climate change were affecting their ability to live their lives. And overall, that was 45%. So we really do see these high levels of, I would say, problematic worry and concern. And younger people do seem to be more worried than older people, I think for understandable reasons. Especially they know that they are going to have to cope with the impacts of climate change, whereas older people may think, well, honestly, I'll be dead before it gets really bad. So the younger people know they face this future. And people who are more vulnerable tend to also be more worried. And you can see that, I think, in this chart. Some of the highest levels of worry were in the Philippines, for example, which is really experiencing climate change as an existential threat. Nigeria was also quite worried. And Brazil also fairly worried, one of the smallest proportions of people who said they were not worried at all. A more recent survey just last year tried to focus in on the United States. We had a sample of 15,000 young people. So this is between the ages of 16 and 25. And we found that 38% said their feelings about climate change negatively affected their daily life, and 43% said it was negatively affecting their mental health. So again, really high levels of worry and concern at a possibly problematic level that's interfering with ability to function. This is higher among those who have personally experienced the effects of climate change. So in one study, people online were surveyed about their climate anxiety just before the Western North American heat dome. And so the researchers took advantage of the opportunity to do the survey over again after the heat dome, a prolonged period of very high temperatures, and found that climate anxiety had significantly increased over that period. The survey of Americans last year found that we asked them if they had experienced extreme weather events associated with climate change, and that their report of that experience was significantly correlated with most of the outcome variables, especially that sort of self-reported impact on mental health. And other surveys around the world have found a negative relationship between climate anxiety and well-being and a positive relationship with measures of anxiety and depression. So this chart, each different bar represents a different country. You can see up at the top, the dotted line is 0. So every country except Japan is well below 0. They have a significant negative relationship there. The proportion of people who are experiencing problematic levels of climate anxiety, it's not the majority, which doesn't surprise me, but it is significant. We tend to find somewhere between 15% and 25% of people experiencing at least moderate levels. And one reason to care about this anxiety, I think, is that it may affect behavior. So of course, we want people to be mentally healthy. So I don't want people to be experiencing problematic levels of climate anxiety, but also, especially for young people, they're making decisions about their lives that may affect them into the future. And the survey we did in 2023, we found majorities saying that climate change would influence where they chose to live, it would influence plans for the future. A lot of people talking about hesitancy to have children, people saying, I don't know if it's worth putting a lot of effort into my education or a lot of effort into my career because I don't know what the future will hold. So that I'm really struck by and concerned about the impacts of this sort of uncertainty on the way people are planning for the future. Now, it's not just anxiety that people are feeling. I think I focus on anxiety because I think the link to mental health is so profound. But people also describe grief, guilt, anger, and something that can be described as moral outrage. So in the 2021 study, we asked people to rate how much they felt a variety of emotions, and you can see sad, afraid, and anxious are up there as the most commonly endorsed, but angry, powerless, and helpless, and even guilty, at least 50% of people describing. So that guilt is really both, I would say, guilt and anger are very moralistic responses, that idea that something is wrong. So moral emotions include guilt, shame. Some of them are self-directed. Some of them are other-directed. So guilt, shame, and pride, all kind of evaluations of one's own behavior, either negatively or positively. Anger and contempt, moral evaluations of other people's behavior. Many people report feeling angry. Climate scientists have talked about frustration they feel when other people do not act to address climate change. Not surprisingly, there are regional differences. People in countries that have contributed more to climate change, developed Western societies, tend to feel more guilt. People in the global South who have contributed very little to climate change but are experiencing the impacts are more likely to feel anger. And morality is relevant for a variety of reasons. One is that I kind of just hinted at, is the fact that the people who are responsible for climate change are not the same as the people who are being most harmed by climate change. So that seems unjust to many people. There's also that inequity of vulnerability, inequity of impacts. They're not at all distributed equally. And I'll say more about that in a second. So we experience that inequity as unjust. And psychologists have examined the idea of moral injury associated with either witnessing or participating in unethical behavior. Often reflects a feeling that those in authority are not doing what they should. It's been described as a betrayal of what's right. And the idea of moral injury really came out of work with combat veterans, many of whom would report sort of war crimes or witnessing or participating in actions during combat that they felt were wrong, and their response to that moral violation. And the consequence of that can be a loss of sense of meaning. It can be blaming yourself, and it is associated with a variety of mental health problems. So I have been working with colleague Elizabeth Marks to develop a scale on moral distress. We found two components: moral distress associated with other people's behavior and distress associated with your own behavior. And we find positive correlations with climate anxiety, with depression, with general anxiety, also with experiences of climate change and a sense of connection to the natural world. All of these seem to be associated with greater moral distress. So this moral distress, as I said, is partly a response to the idea that the impacts of extreme events varies. It's partly about how much you've experienced, so the magnitude of the impact. Also, people who are sensitized to the event by prior exposure to trauma. So previous experience tends to lead people to be more strongly affected by another flood or another storm. But also those resources we have after the event. Do you have the financial resources to recover? Do you have the social support system that is so strongly associated with mental health? Do you have access to healthcare? Do you have access to the needs of life, food, water, and shelter? All of which is to remind us that the impacts of climate change on mental health depend on not just the intensity of the impact, but your vulnerability and sources of support you have. So some groups are more vulnerable, and there are a variety of ways, a variety of factors that can make people more vulnerable. There are differences in the experiences people are exposed to. Especially, we can think of geographic differences. So again, some people live in areas that are experiencing greater impacts than others. Also, people whose jobs involve greater exposure. So firefighters, emergency responders, these people are facing greater impacts on their mental health. There are physiological vulnerabilities. So we know the elderly are more vulnerable to heat, for example. People who are already suffering from mental illness are more vulnerable to heat. In many cases, psychoactive medications interfere with the ability to regulate your own body temperature. People with disabilities are often left out of evacuation plans. It's very difficult for them to maybe get the information they need or to respond to emergency alerts. And then there are economic vulnerabilities associated with insufficient financial resources and social vulnerabilities associated with your position in society. So if we think about these economic vulnerabilities, people with fewer economic resources tend to be more exposed to environmental hazards. They're often living in the areas that are more vulnerable to climate change. They, of course, tend to live in lower quality housing that provides less protection from things like storms and floods. And they have less access to green space, which is a very positive source of stress reduction and mental health. I also want to highlight that women and children experience kind of multiple vulnerabilities associated with physiological differences as well as social roles. So for different reasons, children, because of their systems are developing, are more physiologically vulnerable. Women are often more vulnerable because of pregnancy, but definitely they have different roles in society that give them different access to power and resources. So women do seem to be more affected by heat waves. Often social conditions mean that they are more likely to drop out of school if there's not enough money to continue to support them. In some parts of the world, they face early marriages when the family is economically stressed. I've talked about migration. Women are at increased threats of sexual violence or trafficking during migration. We know that women are more vulnerable to domestic violence. And you can see the other factors. There's greater food insecurity, more worry, and they're more likely to die in climate change-related disasters, often due to inequities in access to information. again, some parts of the world where women might not know how to drive, so they cannot drive to escape from an expected natural disaster. They are more responsible for others, so that they are not just focused on protecting themselves, but they're trying to get their children to safety. I heard a woman talk once about a country, and I don't remember which, where there were very strict prohibitions about women's participation in public spheres. And she talked about a flood where a woman was trying to cross the road under, and there was lots of water. So she was moving through the water, and she needed a helping hand to get out of the road, but men were not allowed. It was prohibited for men to touch women they weren't related to. So it was considered inappropriate for them to help her get out of the flooded area. So these very perhaps non-obvious ways in which women can be vulnerable to climate change. And as I've kind of said already, children are more vulnerable because their bodily systems, including their nervous systems, are still developing. Their bodies are less good at regulating their own temperature. That's a system that's still developing. They're also developing emotional skills. So we know that children who experience early trauma sometimes over-respond to trauma in later years. They have not developed that ability to regulate those strong emotions. And also they're dependent on others. So even if the child themselves is not affected, if their caregivers are affected, that will have a carry-on impact for the child. Climatic conditions are associated with preterm birth, which is also associated with mental health problems. People who care more or are more affected by threats to the environment are going to be more strongly affected, which means in many cases indigenous peoples who tend to have stronger connections to the natural world will be more threatened. On the other hand, they may experience stronger impacts. On the other hand, many indigenous peoples have, especially in, actually around the world, they've often been displaced. So they are used to changing conditions. They are used to sort of monitoring changes in their environment and responding to that. And so they do have actually some knowledge that can be beneficial to provide lessons in how to adapt to changing conditions. And agricultural workers, clearly very economically dependent on the natural environment. And so when that natural environment is threatened or changed, suicide levels tend to go up. I want to make sure to get to the kind of third question in the last 10 minutes of the talk, which is how can psychologists be involved in encouraging healthy responses to climate change? And really, I just want to stress that negative impacts are not inevitable. So the climate is changing. It's already changing. It will continue to change for at least a little while because of the greenhouse gases that we've already emitted. But the extent of that change can be reduced through mitigation. So any kind of behavioral change or technology change or policy change that reduces the amount of greenhouse gases that we emit. And psychologists know about behavior change. We also know about communication. So psychologists can help encourage mitigation by communicating the risks to health and also focus on interventions for behavior change. Environmental protection clearly involves human behavior. Even if there are policy changes, individuals make the decision to whether or not to go along with those policies or not. And they make the decisions whether or not to support those policies. So individual behavioral choices and attitudes have a strong impact on sort of the extent to which we engage in climate protective behavior. And psychologists are experts in behavior and behavior change. We know that some of the things that matter the most are social norms, but also individual values and perceptions of self-efficacy are very powerful predictors of people's willingness to engage in behavior change. Another thing, though, moving beyond that idea of mitigation, because the climate is already changing, we also need to focus on adaptation. And how can we change our individual behavior, our societal patterns in ways that reduce the mental health risks? Some of the things that would be very helpful there include expanding access to mental health care, which is really under-resourced around the world. Mental health is not taken as seriously as a health risk compared to physical health. So expanding access, expanding training in mental health responses, especially into the ways in which people prepare for and respond to extreme weather events. Making sure that the mental health resources are culturally appropriate for specific locations, and that might include their nature-based therapy, given the increasing research about the positive effects of exposure to natural environments, and also attention to the impacts on diverse communities, recognizing that not everybody is affected in the same way by the same events. So we need to provide resources that are mindful of those differences. In terms of promoting resilience at an individual level, if we think about individual mental health, people often talk about different kinds of coping by dealing with your negative emotions, coping by addressing the problem, and coping by finding meaning in the struggle. And returning to the issue of moral distress and moral injury, it's possible that this will affect coping, and it could have a negative effect. One of the things that can happen if you're aware of behavior that you perceive as unethical or immoral, there may be kind of a moral licensing where you think everybody's doing this bad thing, I can do it too, or a moral disengagement where we try to reduce our sense of a moral violation, perhaps by minimizing harm, derogating the victims, and denying personal responsibility for the impacts. But moral distress may also have a positive impact because moral anger about environmental injustice actually does predict intentions and behavior to protect the environment and more generally pro-environmental attitudes. So although mental health services are extremely important, we also need to focus on helping people to find meaning in the struggle. And that meaning can include a sense of hope that a positive future is possible, very much a sense of purpose that I myself can help to address climate change and do something about it, and trust that other people also care and are also going to work on the problem. And we know that, again, evidence that people who feel this sort of constructive hope, a hope based on possibility for a positive future, not based on denial that there's a problem, that is associated with pro-environmental behavior. And this includes a willingness to take action to help address climate change, a belief that if everyone works together, we can address climate change, and a sort of self-efficacy, so not believing that climate change is beyond your control, but believing that, no, there is something that you can do that will affect or can address the problem of climate change. And I want to stress that this possibility for hope can be created and encouraged by our social interactions. So it's very important for people to feel some sense of self-efficacy, again, some sense that what they do will matter. And also our social interactions can provide that sense of self-efficacy and certainly can provide that sense of trust in others. We need to talk to each other about climate change in a way that encourages a general feeling that, yes, everyone is aware of the problem and everyone recognizes that they have a role to play in addressing it. Because some people do report feeling dismissed, that when they try to talk to other people about their concerns, they're told not to worry about it. So that is not going to encourage hope. research is still in its early days, but there are some best practices recommended for addressing mental health problems associated with climate anxiety, which is, again, to validate people's feelings and acknowledge them rather than dismiss them, to help people deal with their emotions when they become overwhelming, to encourage social connections and connections to the natural world, to take care of yourself, but also to get involved in climate action and to be aware of social justice issues. But kind of one of the last points I want to make is that we can't just focus on individual mental health. We need to think about collective well-being as well. So encouraging connections, encouraging education about climate change and about how to adapt, and encouraging, again, that sort of more broadly available mental health care. We have to change societies as well as to changing individual mindsets in order to respond to climate change. And the mental health field can and should be part of this change in society, that we should train mental health professionals on how climate change is likely to affect mental health. We should educate the public. We should advocate for better mental health funding as well as for mitigating climate change. We should do more research into interventions that promote sustainable behavior and promote individual mental health. We need to be aware of our own experiences, our own emotions in response to climate change. And I think as a professional responsibility to try and adopt environmentally sustainable clinical practices. So utilizing the psychology of climate change to respond in an effective way means to understand people's, or to respond to people's understandings and perceptions of risk and use that, that knowledge to decide effective messaging about the risks of climate change. To use what we know about the impacts on mental health and well-being to describe these impacts to the public, including impacts that might not be as obvious, these long-term kind of impacts on mental health. To use what we know about how to make behavioral changes to encourage social changes that encourage mitigation. And to use what we know about the possibilities for resilience, especially to use the restorative power of nature to promote individual mental health. And that is my last slide. That was a lot of information, so I hope it's been useful, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Clayton, for your lecture. I'm certain that we all learned a lot from you today. Now, Viviane has some questions to start with our debate, with our question session. So she can speak now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fernando. Professor Clayton, I would like to thank you for all of our colleagues, our class, to the lecture and and the articles and the papers you provide for us. This topic of climate change, I think it's very emotional for us because we suffered a lot for a lot of climate changes and a lot of nature disasters, such as the floods in May, and every notice about a new storm for us is a new anxious. We feel very anxious about a new storm, a possibility of new floods. So study about the climate changes and psychological factors is a thematic for us very, very sensitive and very powerful our practice, because our practice and clinic and health and a lot of areas of practice is changing because of that. So we'd like to thank you very much. And I think about the lecture and the papers you provide for us, and I think in a few questions, and I want to start with the general one. Is I am intrigued about the study that you made about feelings of young people about the government actions, and I want to know if has there been any movement by you and your team to present the research data to government entities? Is there any thoughts or any plans to do that? If it's already been, what effects were produced? And I'm sorry, I'm very nervous about talking in English. I'm very rusty. I'm not practicing at all. So
no, your English is very good. Yes, thank you for that question. Actually, the research really was motivated by a hope of influencing public policy, and we hoped that governments would pay attention. It's not easy to have a direct impact on the government. The 2021 study that looked at countries around the world did get quite a lot of press, and again, we hoped that people were paying attention. There was a lot of media coverage. We can't say whether it had any impact, but it certainly doesn't seem like it, honestly. The study that we published this fall, we really wanted to highlight in the United States the reasons that we need to pay attention to climate change. And nevertheless, the results of the election were very disappointing. With the likelihood that the U.S. will be doing less about climate change in the near future, not more. So it's hard to be optimistic about influencing the government, but nevertheless, at some level, I think you have to keep trying. And actually, we do know that the majority of people, regardless of political party, would like the government to be doing something about climate change. And a very recent survey in the United States found that even people who voted for Donald Trump do want the government to do something about climate change. So our hope is to continue to kind of highlight and publicize this research to show that there is public support for those kinds of efforts. So I guess the answer to your question is yes, I hope that there will be an impact. It's certainly not going to be a direct impact, but I think it's worth continuing to try to publicize this issue in two ways. One is just that people do care and they do want action, and then that the ratings of governmental response are really low. So people are disappointed in their governments. But if it doesn't affect voting, then it's not going to affect the officials. So,
at our region, we are very disappointed as well, because a lot of mayors have been re-elected in this recent election here. And a lot of mayors not think about the floods and not action and not has a very proactive and very efficient actions in floods. So we're very disappointed as well. But I think small actions like we have been done at this class to promote a lecture in YouTube and disseminate on Instagram. It's a small actions that can be very powerful as well. I think it's very. I think we can miss the hope for some changes. Another question that I've been done that I did is how can the analysis of environmental identity for your assessment guide interventions to help individuals manage their anxieties and face a new episodes like we did in floods, and also pressure governmental changes?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think we don't have the information we need yet, but one important message is to recognize that we're facing this, in a sense, a dilemma. We know that it's good to care about the natural world, and that itself is associated with stronger mental health and happiness, to have a strong environmental identity. But if you care more about the natural world, you're also more likely to be negatively affected by damages to that. So it requires. I wouldn't say we should stop connecting to the natural world by any means, but it is a challenge. I think recognizing that, some of the ways in which people are harmed by changes to the environment, that sense of disrupted identity, disrupted perhaps place attachment, just being aware of that can help guide more sensitive responses, perhaps, and also recognizing that reconnecting to the natural world can be a way to promote mental health. How that can affect sometimes, and I'm not a specialist in political action, although I certainly care about it. I think sometimes it can be more effective to not address the issue directly, but to try and be more indirect about it. So instead of saying we need to do something to address climate change, we might say, can you establish a public park or public green space here? Often that can actually help to deal with the physical effects of climate change. So for example, more green spaces might help with flooding, manage that sort of, because the water can drain through the green spaces where it can't drain through the streets. So flooding is less problematic if you have plenty of green space. The green space can help protect from higher temperatures and so on. So it's very useful, and then of course the mental health impacts. So it's very useful to have those green spaces, and maybe local officials can be encouraged to support that kind of infrastructure without having to talk about climate change if they don't want to talk about climate change.
Thank you so much for the answers, and thank you so much for all.
Professor, good morning, everyone. Good morning, Professor Clayton. I also want to thank you for your presentation. It was incredibly. We received a question on YouTube. I'm reading it from Camila. She said, "It's a pleasure to see you, Susan. I would love to hear your thoughts on the relationship between childhood climate change, perception, climate anxiety, and pro-environment behavior." Is it?
Mm-hmm. That isn't. Thank you for that question. That is an interesting question. I have not seen any. I know about the impacts of childhood experiences on mental health issues and cognitive issues. I have not seen any research on longitudinal impacts of early exposure to climate change on development of environmental identity. Yeah, that is a great question. I really have to think about that. We know that those early experiences are associated with increased anxiety and increased concern, but whether they tend to lead people to, yes, I really don't know. I think that's a good question to examine. Now, we do know that people who have a stronger environmental identity are more likely to be involved in pro-environmental behavior. The question of whether people who are more anxious also experience or also more likely to engage in behavior is an interesting one. There have been inconsistent results. I think the research is refining the question of when does anxiety lead to behavior and when does it lead rather to a sort of paralysis. And some of the studies have suggested that a moderate level of climate anxiety is associated with behavioral change, but a very high level of climate anxiety is not. So that relationship is complex. It's not just going to be a simple more of one is more of the other. But yes, these long-term impacts, I think partly because we weren't talking about climate anxiety. I don't think I had thought about climate anxiety, more than about 5 years ago, not specifically in those terms. So we haven't been aware of these issues for long enough to really accumulate that longitudinal research. But I think that is a very good question about how the childhood experiences will affect people.
Jessica, you can make your question.
Hi, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay. Thank you. I'm turning my webcam. I don't know why it isn't working. Just okay. Now I think you can see me. So good morning, Professor Clayton. I'm so grateful for your presentation. You already solved a lot of questions that I had, but you answered what we can do as a psychologist. But and I already told this in another class. Maybe my classmates will remember. I feel so pessimist about the future, and you told us as well that sometimes you feel like this. And you inspired me a lot about what we can do, but it's really tricky. We had to advise our patients and be a source of inspiration for people as well. But what can we do when we feel so pessimist, Because, like you said, the U.S. elections is an example. Like Viviane told us, the city elections was so horrible. Our city was flooded, like hard. And the mayor didn't do anything to solve that. People elect him again, and it's raining again, it's flooding again. So, the prognosis is so bad. So what do we do with our climate anxiety so we can help people, because it's so hard for me to help people when I myself kind of don't believe that our future will be, better. So again, thank you so much for your presentation. And I want to know, what do you do with your feelings, in order to continue your study, because it's really, really hard. Thank you so much.
I want to compliment Jessica, because I remember when she's talking in the floods, in the May floods here, we had a lot of places that bring people that lost everything, and I was a volunteer, and the rain didn't stop, and the people was very anxious, and the rain didn't stop, and I was, oh my god, the rain has to stop, and I think, oh my god, how can I help people when I'm feeling anxious because the rain doesn't stop? I was thinking about it. So I think it's an example of Jessica's talking. So it's a little compliment.
Yes, thank you for raising this question. I can certainly feel the same way, that I do feel very pessimistic sometimes, but I want to, certainly to give my students I want them to feel optimistic. So how do we deal with that? And it's a reminder that for anyone who wants to help others, and especially young people, deal with climate change, we have to sort of be mindful of our own emotional responses and be aware of how we're feeling, and be sort of in control of how we're feeling a little bit in order to give those positive messages. I think for me, I would say this is true for everybody, and it works for me. That sort of meaning-focused coping, where I think about all the other people who are addressing this issue and are working on this issue. And for example, so it was mentioned that I was involved with the last report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was this UN body that produces these massive scientific reports about the impacts of climate change approximately every 40 years. These hundreds of scientists coming from around the world to address these issues. And, so we had multiple meetings, and then COVID happened, and we stopped meeting, but, multiple in-person meetings. These were not gloomy affairs. People were, they were energized. They felt privileged to essentially have the opportunity to help address the issue. And recognizing that, it's a lot of work and it's not compensated. These are people who are doing this because they think it will make a difference. So it was really inspiring to me to recognize that the people who really understand climate change, they are not giving up. They are working. They are convinced that there are things that are worth doing. That sense of community is both encouraging and energizing, and that, I think, is one of the most important things for me to maintain hope. And then, of course, sometimes you just need something more specific. Like, I'm feeling terrible right now. What am I going to do? So if it's not raining, just going out and taking a walk really helps me with my mental health. The physical activity combined with, hopefully a natural scenery is very calming and restorative. If you can't do that, some sort of mindfulness techniques. And I think it helps to stop thinking about your own feelings and just be responding to somebody else's feelings. Allows you to step outside yourself and I'm not thinking about my own pessimism. I'm thinking about how I can help this other person's pessimism, and that can be at least a temporary way to get past that overwhelming feeling of despair. I see there are some hands raised. I don't know if someone else will.
I guess it's our turn. I'm not sure. Okay. Well, I have a question. I have two questions actually, but we'll do the first. I'm very interested about the concept of psychological distance, but at the same time, I think psychological distance is an interesting construct to understand how people connect with climate change. But at the same time, I think if we connect too much with climate change, maybe we became like paralyzed by everything, and then feel like Jessica and Viviane was talking about, feel a little more pessimistic about the future. So what do you think, Professor, we can do to generate like a mild psychological distance to be close enough to do something, to do some climate action and feel, connected with the problem, but not too much and become like a hopelessness about the future, Do you think there is a solution for that? Because I think one of the problems that we have with government is that they don't feel like being affected by it. Mm-hmm. Even if they feel they do like something, they build a bunker somewhere to be safe, mm-hmm. Not be worried a lot about problems. So do you think there is a solution to, engage people using the concept of psychological distance, but not engage too much to make paralysis? This is the first question.
Yes, absolutely. I think one of the things to bear in mind is who is the audience for your message, and some people are already very aware and very engaged, so they might need help stepping back a little bit. Other people are not engaged enough, and so they need to be encouraged to connect more strongly. So thinking about that middle ground, if somebody is starting on one end, you move them in this way. If they're starting on the other end, you move them in this way. I think for government officials, absolutely. I am not a government official, and I don't know any personally, but I suspect they feel quite a lot of distance and opportunities for them to hear from people who have been directly affected. I think those personal stories of impact can help reduce the psychological distance. Also, if things that they care about are being affected, giving them those very concrete examples. The other thing we need to remember is that, psychological distance is sort of or can be a defense mechanism. So people are, when their emotions feel too strong, they are using this as a way to protect themselves. One reason our emotions might be too strong is if we feel helpless. So if you think there's something you can do, you might not need to use psychological distance as a defense mechanism. So encouraging people, pointing them to specific things. If you do this, then we won't face as much flooding in the future. I mean, obviously, sometimes the solution is not quite as simple, but not just telling people how bad things are, but also telling them what can be done and encouraging that feeling of potential efficacy. That can also reduce the need for people to use psychological distance.
Okay, thank you so much. So now I have, it's a fast one. We are conducting a study here, and we are trying to inform people about climate change and using the concept of psychological distance as something that will impact how people receive the message. And we received a response from one of the participants saying that our study was not relevant because we are trying to engage people in action, climate action, but this is not relevant because all of the problems that we have in climate change was caused by big techs and big companies, and we should look and talk with the big companies, not study individual behavior. But after seeing your presentation, it seems to me that if we engage people in climate action, doing small things at once, every day, they may not have a huge impact on climate change, but at the same time, they may feel better because they are doing something. And do something, maybe, I don't know, may just improve a little bit of their climate anxiety. So do you think I get the idea? Because I know that we are not the big responsibles for what we are having right now with the extreme weather events. But I think if we do something, just something, we might be better and feel at least not paralyzed by everything. So do you think it is a good idea to do something?
Yes, I completely agree. And one of the things that people feel most in regard to climate change is helpless and powerless. And so giving people something to do is probably going, or encouraging people to do something that they can do is probably going to have a beneficial effect on mental health just by making them feel less helpless. And even though there is that danger of people thinking that it's individual responsibility, really we do need to, of course, hold the corporations accountable and the governments accountable. But individual actions and behaviors are not irrelevant, and individual behavioral choices actually have a big impact on what we do. You know, individuals can choose to try to reduce their use of fossil fuels and to call on governments to be accountable. And even though one individual's behavior may not be impactful by itself, we all have that very important source of power that we can affect other people too, so we can start to change the social norm. And so if a large number of people in a community are showing that they care about climate change, then that will probably be more compelling to elected officials as well.
Professor Clayton, we received another question, this time from Carlos. He says, do you think that a pragmatic philosophical system like Buddhism, from a non-religious perspective, which promotes the consciousness about the interconnectivity between all beings, would be a possible approach for changing people's mindset? Considering that a change in our individual mindset could be the starting point for a real change.
Thank you. I do think, and I don't know very much about Buddhism, but I think an awareness of interconnectedness, a sort of a systems thinking, is extremely useful. For one thing, it's accurate. You know, we are all interconnected. So I think many people do not realize the way in which their own behavior affects the natural world, and they don't realize the extent to which the natural world affects them, or the way in which their own behavior even affects other individuals. So I think if we learned to recognize those interconnections more, I think absolutely that would be a positive way of, it would lead to a mindset that was more likely to address this issue effectively. Now, I'm also, it's not easy to change people's mindset and to talk about it. I wouldn't say let's change the way everyone thinks about everything, because that's just not going to happen. But I think that we can have educational institutions that really that highlight this idea of interconnectedness. I think that is definitely a direction we could go in.
Fernando.
Thank you, Professor. I have one question, and maybe it's an impossible one, or it's $1 million question. Do you have in mind any idea of how to reach government or companies in respect to how they can just for context, we're talking about how we intervene with clients, for example, with people in general. So is there any effective way of how we can address these questions by, I don't know, pressuring government or companies in order to do something about this too, thinking about a broader aspect of it?
I think, and again, obviously there are no simple solutions here, but one thing to be aware of is what are the values that are driving that particular, company official or that particular elected official. And even though as an individual, they might have one set of values, they might feel that, well, as a company head, I need my primary value has to be economic considerations. So it might not work very well to try and make a moral argument to that person. But if you can make an economic argument, and I do think there are some pretty powerful economic arguments that can be made for the need to address climate change. Lots and lots of data about the benefits, the economic benefits we get from a healthy environment and the economic costs of responding to climate change. So that would be, one short answer would just be to try to find a message that meets the values of the person in that role or occupation. For an elected official, what do they care about? Often they care about, public approval. So showing them evidence that the majority of their constituents would like them to do something about this, that would be a good kind of argument.
Thank you. I can read a question here that Erica sent. She said, "Hi, Professor Susan. She can't turn on her camera and her microphone as she's at work, so she's writing her question here. She said, my question regards our mental health work balance as PhD students and researchers. In an already highly demanding area, how can we reach a middle ground and acknowledge the impact of climate change and climate anxiety in our capacity to keep working and producing, not at the same pace, but at a possible pace? Having worked in the academic field as a psychologist during COVID and now experiencing the floods, I think we often find ourselves dealing with other people's mental health and the impact of contextual factors, such as climate change, whereas within the university and research context, there is little space to consider how those changes might affect us as researchers in both our productivity and mental health.
Yes, I do think that there is often a general tendency, especially I think as psychologists, to think I'm studying this issue and we distance ourselves from the issue because we're studying it, or we're engaged with it professionally and we're not acknowledging our own sort of personal involvement with that issue. So to recognize that I'm studying this problem, but I am also a person who is experiencing this problem. How is it affecting me? How should it affect me? Is an important question for us all to think about. And I'm very, when I talked about the best practices for individual mental health, I highlighted self-care. I'm very strongly in favor of the idea that you have to maintain your own mental health or you can't help anyone else. So that might mean, stepping away. It might mean, doing whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. But also think, okay, I'm also somebody who is engaged with this issue in different ways. Are there things that I should be doing to better acknowledge the reality of climate change? Are there practices that I should be engaged in? And without wanting to make anyone feel bad or guilty, I think, for example, in academics, there are a lot of us who are focusing on climate change and are very aware of the negative impacts, but we are not thinking about how to change our professional activities. Conference attendance being a great example, big carbon impact of a lot of international conferences. And again, I'm not saying that we need to, that those need to go away, but I think we need to be acknowledging the impact of those things and discussing whether we should be changing our approach to international conferences and try and lower the carbon footprint. So that's just a very specific example of thinking about trying to put yourself in the issue as well, not just think about other people's behavior, other people's mental health, but to recognize your own mental health and your own behavior and how those are implicated in the issue.
I have a question about the relationship between the intragroup bias produced by climate change and the advance of right-wing ideas. So conservatives might feed on the uncertainties due to climate change that increase the intragroup bias. And the intergroup bias combined, matches the discourse of the right. So if you think this can be an effect of the climate change itself, this intergroup bias in a more big scale.
Yes, I think that I haven't seen any research on this specifically, but I think that seems very plausible that just thinking about climate change often awakens this general sense of dread and competition over, diminishing resources. And so it might highlight people's tendency to, object to immigrants and want immigrants to be deported, or might highlight those sort of group polarization that I think is clearly a really big part of our difficulty in responding to climate change is just is the group polarization. So I'm not sure what to do about that. I think people do hope that highlighting the collective nature of the problem will encourage cooperation instead of encouraging conflict. But it certainly can have that impact of encouraging conflict.
Yeah, I have a optimistic example, maybe, that can be applied to the climate change. That is, our behavior changed a lot in the last 3 decades related to smoking in public. And this had a big industry, very powerful, behind it, the behavior of smoking in general. And we could change individuals to quit smoking and governments to change the policies and cities and environments and buildings. And like 30 years ago, we would have someone in this room smoking and people, at home smoking while they were, okay, we are drinking coffee still, but so far smoking is worse than drinking coffee anyway. This big change encompasses many levels, like international World Health Organization, research and public policies and economic choices and individual choices. So I wish the same applies to climate change, that we have changes in different levels that combined can make in 30 years a very strong change on the way people believe and think about their individual and collective behavior. So I think this is my optimistic, this is where I cling when I get into despair. I think, no, wait. If we did this with smoking, maybe we can do it with climate change.
I think that's a great example. And yeah, something I often try to encourage, and I'm speaking to my students, for example, is because they are so young, they don't realize how quickly some changes can happen and how profound some changes can be. And for myself, I often think about smartphones, and which 20 years ago, I don't think anybody had. And now we all walk around with these computers in our hands that tell us everything we need to know we interact. It's completely changed the way we live our lives. Or in a negative way, COVID is another example how we changed our behavior so quickly and so rapidly and so profoundly in response to that. So I think a reminder of the fact that change is possible, very extensive, dramatic change is possible, and that it can happen fairly quickly is a good way. That encourages an optimistic perspective, absolutely.
Do you have another questions? Comments? Okay. So I guess that's it. Okay, thank you, Professor Susan. It was a great pleasure to have you here. It was amazing to see your talk and to hear your talk. And I was reading about your papers about climate anxiety, and it was a lot of very relevant information. I guess I need to read the other papers that you cited here because everything is so much interesting. So thank you so much for accepting to be here with us. And I guess that's it.
Yeah.
So much.
Thank you for your attention and for your very interesting questions and comments. I enjoyed the discussion.
Okay, thank you.
Very good.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Stop the transmission.
Yeah.